Hi, my name is Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have Jay Greene joining us once again in the studio. He is with the Heritage Foundation, a senior fellow research there in the Center for Education Policy. Hey, thank you so much for being with us again today.
Thank you.
You recently, just a few days ago, I think a little, maybe over the weekend or right before, released an article talking about school choice in Texas and how they are set for victory there. And you point out too, I think, really significant and key findings about that. One, you talk about how these national organizations have really come together, and they are now, school choice has become a litmus test almost for lawmakers now, whether or not they support it. And if they vote no, there's risk involved now. Talk to us about that.
Right. So everything in that piece where it says Texas, you could cross it out and write Arkansas.
Absolutely.
And it pretty much holds true. So the obstacle to passing school choice in many red states, Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, is that rural superintendents have gotten the ear of their legislators and have told them, look, if you pass this, you're going to hurt a large employer in your district and it's bad for business, right? And not hearing from the other side, legislators have been swayed by their rural superintendents. And that has made us come up short in conservative leaning states with high rural populations. But I think things are changing, and they are changing in two big ways. One is, as you mentioned, national organizations have decided to make support for school choice a litmus test issue for those rural Republican legislators, so that if they don't vote with their party platform and go against it, there are national organizations that will find and fund primary challengers. So this is now altering the political calculation of these legislators, so that before they only heard from rural superintendents and didn't hear objections on the other side. Now they're facing a risk on the other side. If they vote no, something bad could happen. They could face a primary challenge and have that primary challenger be funded by national organizations. The other thing that puts them at greater risk of voting no is that there are parents in rural communities who could be mobilized to support primary challengers on this issue. And the reason why they could be mobilized is that those parents are beginning to detect at a higher rate values disconnects between the values they're trying to teach at home and those being taught in their school. And so they're noticing that the schools don't feel really like theirs anymore. That they are doing what Washington, D.C. wants them to do, or what the State Department of Ed wants them to do, or what the ed school that trained their teachers wants them to do, and not what their community really wants them to do. And so they really are looking for options and more interested in school choice, and then willing to support a primary challenger if their representative or senator doesn't vote for school choice. So I think this is going to change the political calculation for enough rural legislators to get over the hump of 50% in more of these red states with large rural populations. And so that could include Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, I think are all realistic prospects for adopting universal ESAs in the next legislative session.
This issue, until really this past year or so, has been one that conservatives have, they really haven't been held accountable, for voting against the party platform. And like Conduit was mentioned before, you certainly have, they'll pass school choice light and then pat themselves on the back and think that they've accomplished something, which really they haven't, and they're still not adhering to the party platform. And so talk to us about, you briefly mentioned, but how that will shift the political landscape. And then to those legislators who are in rural communities right now, this is still a concern, regardless if data shows that it actually improves your communities and it's good for everyone there. And talk to us about that, and how do you even convince a legislator who is so dead set on, you know what, this is going to close my schools, they're the biggest financial supporter for our community.
So those rural superintendents tend to make two arguments which can't both be true.
Yes.
So they tend to go to their legislators and they say, if you pass universal school choice, universal ESAs, it'll bankrupt our schools and we'll lose jobs. Okay, we're a big employer and it's going to bankrupt us because of school choice.
Right.
But then they also say school choice in rural communities makes no sense because there are no choices here. There are no options here. Now, both of these things can't be true.
Right.
It can't be that the school will be bankrupted by people leaving and there's nowhere for them to go,
Yes.
right? So one of those things has to not be true. And as it turns out, both of those things are not true partially.
Okay.
There are choices
Yeah.
everywhere, as it turns out, including in rural Arkansas. And those choices, some of them are existing in-person options, some of them are virtual options, and some of them are options that don't exist yet, but that could be created if a universal ESA were available. So options do exist, but at the same time, there's no reason to believe, and the experience in other states has clearly demonstrated that it won't bankrupt rural schools. They lose some students whose families are looking for options, but they don't lose everyone overnight. And it gives the schools a chance to adapt and improve in ways that will make them more appealing to retain those families who might be looking for options. And in the same way that the existence of Wendy's doesn't drive McDonald's out of existence. Right. It helps improve both.
Sure.
So I think there's no reason really to fear this, and we have actually a lot of evidence on this from other states. So, for example, in Arizona, where we now have universal ESAs, there are lots of people choosing schools, alternatives to their traditional public school throughout rural Arizona. There's a lot of rural Arizona too. And their academic performance is extremely strong in those rural communities. And their public schools are not going bankrupt. So all those things are happening in Arizona. There's no reason why that can't be true here too. Lastly, I should say that school choice is actually a great vehicle for economic development of rural communities. So part of the challenge that rural communities have faced is the loss of population over time. And part of the reason for that is that families fear that they can't get a quality education where they are, and they have to move to bigger population centers to get a better set of schools. And what school choice does is it allows people to stay in those communities that they like, that they want to be part of, without having to go somewhere to like a bigger city to find schools they like. They can stay where they are and find the schools they like. And that's good for economic development. It's also good for economic development. There may be people in cities who might like the lifestyle of smaller towns and want to move there as long as they could have educational options. And so look, frankly, again, we're seeing this in Arizona where people are moving to Arizona and people are moving to Florida in part because there are educational options available. The same is true for rural Arkansas. We can get people to move to those places which have a lot of attractive features that have communities with values that people like, and they can do it and get the kind of education they want at the same time.
What hurdles do you see or obstacles do you see getting over this conversation and dialogue that it hurts rural communities and ultimately getting this passed?
So I think it is making sure that legislators are hearing from people other than rural superintendents. That's all they've heard in the past. Is the rural superintendent whispering in their ear, "This is going to destroy us." And they need to hear from others. I think they're beginning to hear from others, and they're beginning to look around and see primary challenges that have occurred in other states when rural legislators vote no. And they're also beginning to see groups of parents organized and expressing the desire for options, groups like Moms for Liberty, which are organizing in rural communities. Those people vote.
And they bring their friends to vote.
Right. And they're not it's not just the employees in schools that
Yeah.
vote.
Yeah.
Parents vote too.
Yeah.
And parents are getting organized on this issue.
I love it.
Yeah.
Parent empowerment all the way, right?
And again, I mean, I wrote that piece about Texas.
Yeah.
But honestly, I could have written it about Arkansas too.
Right, because there's so many parallels, and that is one of the biggest arguments that we hear about Arkansas and school choice are those rural communities. I'm from one. I grew up in a tiny town down in South Arkansas, and so I understand that hesitation. But the data shows, and as you've so wonderfully explained, it's only going to help those communities whenever you offer options and choices.
It makes it more attractive
Yeah,
to stay in those communities
right.
and to move to those communities.
Absolutely.
And it strengthens the options for educators, frankly, in those communities, because they can teach in different schools.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can even teach virtually to kids who live in population centers. And so teachers who live in rural communities could have more jobs.
Right. Yeah. Anything else you want to add before I let
No,
you go?
I think the last few times we've talked, I've expressed some skepticism about whether this really was the year
Yeah, you did.
for school choice in
did.
Arkansas. I'm beginning to get much more optimistic.
Good.
And look, we might fall short. Who knows? But I think this might be the year. And as I like to say, you know, every defeat is temporary and every victory is permanent when it comes to school choice.
I love that. Well, let's hope that we get a victory in this upcoming session. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thank you.